I'm Jim Utterback. I'm a member of the class of 1968, and I should say a PhD class, because some of you are puzzling why I wasn't in the classroom with you. I actually took master's classes in '65 and then the doctoral classes the next 2 years. I went to Indiana University to teach in the business school there, and then to the Harvard Business School, and I came back here for, I guess, 15 years as a professor in the School of Engineering, and then joined Sloan in 1996. My interest is sort of in between technology and management. It is product design and manufacturing, and thus innovation in products and processes. I have to confess unashamedly that my world is hardware, not, media and telecommunications and software and virtual things, though I'm trying hard, goaded by my students, to understand how to apply my ideas to that realm. But I really got into product design and development and manufacturing because I loved the tangible physical world and the expression of creativity through material things. And of course that led me to MIT, because this is a very, very special place for those kinds of subjects. While I've been here on the faculty, I have helped to start 4 different master's programs, all of which involve relationships between Sloan and the engineering school. The first of these in 1981 was the Management of Technology program, which now has 800 graduates. It was the first joint degree offered by the School of Engineering and Sloan. There's a newer degree called Systems Design and Management, which is about the design of large-scale systems, like airplanes and computers and highway networks and so on, which started more recently, which is a 1-year joint degree. And then in 1989, we started something called the Leaders for Manufacturing program, which you might be familiar with, which is a 2-degree program, 1 in engineering and 1 in management with a joint thesis. And more recently, just last year, I helped to start something called a biomedical entrepreneurship program, in which students take courses in the Harvard-MIT Division of Health Science and Technology, which is over in the Whitaker Building, and Sloan. And a very special feature of this dual degree program is that the students do a second summer internship at Mass General Hospital. MIT is the only place in the country where someone who's not in a pre-medical program can actually work in a hospital operating room. Of course, they're not touching the patient, but they're taking data and observing and seeing how devices and instruments work and so forth, so that they'll be more knowledgeable and capable of leading biomedical enterprises. And I think it's probably true to say that each of these programs came from demands or requests from alumni like us. And the biomedical entrepreneurship program really started through requests from lots of alumni right around here in the over 200 biotech enterprises around Sloan for more help with leadership for their firms, for their new and growing firms. Of course, some of the graduates we hope will be founders as well, but the question is, how do you lead a firm that's growing by leaps and bounds, but also has many challenges and constraints? We hope that in the near future, Sloan will be in the heart of the biotech Silicon Valley. And my dream is that we'll actually help to create that and be part of the engine for that change. Now, since this is a reunion, I thought it would be kind of fun to go back to 1903, 100 years ago, and look at, just for a minute, and look at what would have been seen as iconic innovations 100 years ago. Now, the title for my talk is the title for my spring class, Innovation. Are you a predator or are you prey? And I've been teaching this about emerging technologies for 3 years, and my students and I have worked out something called a Lotka-Volterra model, modeling the interaction between a predator and prey. And I even thought of giving a fairly technical talk and showing you projections between things like Wi-Fi and 3G and GSM and CDMA and so forth that my students have developed. But I decided, since it was early on a Saturday morning, to keep it a little bit more lighthearted. And in any event, I wanted to try to convince you that the purely competitive image of new and old technologies is really quite misleading. But I did give the talk the title from my class. So if we went back to 1903, we would have seen these three icons of innovation. And it's interesting that these are still products that we use today in more or less the form that we see on the screen. And I think it's an interesting question to ponder. How many things that we use today, every day, are more than 100 years old? When I challenged my freshman seminar with this question, they came up with almost 50 ideas. They came up with a wonderful array of ideas. And it's really quite astonishing how much of the world we live and work in, even though we're focused on the new and on the here and now, on what's happening just this minute, how much of what we really value is something that is like these items. Now, in 1903, the thing on the right, the safety match, would have been the oldest of these three products. And the International Match Company and the Swedish Match Company would have been large and important enterprises. Had there been a Fortune 500, I'm sure the International Match Company would have been one of the top companies. The mousetrap was actually a brand new idea. It had its 100th anniversary 3 years ago. And the Victor wooden mousetrap is essentially used in exactly the patented form that it took at the very beginning. And you can see innovation has basically consisted of making bigger and bigger ones and automating the process. And the light bulb, which looked just like that, actually in 1878 was celebrating its 25th anniversary. And of course, Thomas Edison played a rather major role in local industry here and in MIT. One of his early generators is over in the lobby of the electrical engineering building. So I thought it would be fun just to look at these icons for a minute. If you thought about the world my grandparents lived in Sigourney, Iowa, they would have used the safety matches and the mousetrap a fair amount. Of course, they cooked and stayed warm with fires. My dad, till the year before he died, was an ace at splitting wood. I once asked him if he could hit a spot twice within 1/4 of an inch, and he said if he couldn't hit it within 1/16 of an inch, he'd quit. And he could split wood like nobody's business, because he had to split something like 15 or 20 cords of wood a winter to keep the family warm. So they used matches a lot. They didn't have a refrigerator, but they had an ice box. They didn't have running water, but they did have a hand pump in the kitchen, which was seen as a great thing. And they probably used kerosene lamps. Boston would have had electric lights and telephones, and automobiles in 1903. But in fact, my grandparents had, at best, a train and the telegraph. So it was a very different world. And the reason I wanted to bring this up was to ask you, what are we doing today that we might talk about 100 years from now? What sorts of things are we doing in my world of product design and manufacturing, and perhaps in the world you work in, that will really have meaning and value, and perhaps even be usable in its today form in 2103. And I'd really like to end our conversation with the question of, what do you think the Sloan schools should be doing in the context of MIT and the world we live in to really shape and affect our world? Because I think we can be sure that even 30 years from now, the world is going to be completely different, and the industries are going to be completely different than what we have now, and almost unimaginably different. And I think it's I wanted to put this image up not only because it was a bit quaint and iconic, but maybe to stimulate us to think about that. And I think the Sloan School has a very, very special and critical role to play among all the business schools in the world, or perhaps there are only 2 or 3 others that could play the kind of role in entrepreneurship and really creating the foundations for the 21st century that our school can play. Okay, well, I'd like to move on now to 1923. I already gave this away a little bit. I wanted to show you 2 very important people in the life of MIT. And this picture actually comes from the MIT Historical Archives. They allowed me to use it. Do you know who these characters are? Who's on the right? Edison. And who's on the left? George Eastman. This is the founder of MIT as it exists today. George Eastman wrote 3 checks at his dining room table, each for $10 million. I believe it was in 1912 or 13. One of them was for the MIT campus that we're standing on and for the main building. And one was to the Rochester Institute of Technology, and the other was to the Eastman School. Well, maybe there were 4. I think it was Eastman School of Music, and then there was a chain of dental schools. He had very bad teeth, and he wanted to make sure people didn't have to suffer as he had, and he founded a chain of dental schools and clinics. So Eastman was the anonymous donor of the money for the MIT campus. And of course, after he died, it was okay to say that he had done that. And we think of Edison when we think of the light bulb, but that was really, he considered the light bulb relatively trivial. His favorite invention among the 1,000 or so that he patented was the motion picture camera, which is here in this wonderful picture of Eastman and Edison's first meeting about 20 years after they worked together to develop the movie camera. Edison simply couldn't get any film to work in the camera. And he wrote to Eastman, since Eastman was in charge of a then nascent and growing photography company in Rochester, and asked him if he could help. And Eastman doubled the thickness of his film and cut the sprocket holes in it for Edison, and actually created the first successful motion picture film, which you see here. And in fact, that became the 35mm format that we use today, or is becoming archaic today, that we use for still pictures as well, because it was 35mm strip of film. And Edison wrote back enthusiastically after he tested this that he thought we now had the key to motion pictures. And this proceeded to make Eastman's company a great and powerful company. I think by far the largest sales of films are for motion pictures, not for still images or x-rays or anything like that. And it also gave a tremendous boost to Edison's company. And I think when we talk about alliances and technical joint ventures and so on, we perhaps think that these are more contemporary ideas than they really are. Because back in 1923, folks like these were working very closely together to do what at the time seemed like very revolutionary things. And there was a doctoral thesis in our department just a couple years ago by Pek-Wei So, looking at a lot of alliances, and she showed that companies that are more central in a network of alliances are much more successful and innovative than those that are at the periphery. And I think the huge manufacturing and industrial complex that existed around here and in New York in the 20s certainly is another example of that finding. Now, I put this in here not only because it's kind of fun and it reminds us a little bit of 80 years ago and about MIT, but because I was asked a couple of years ago for the merger of ABC and Disney to make a little introduction about innovation for them. So Richard Brenner of ABC News made this tape to show to the first meeting of the top management of these two companies, and tried to summarize all my ideas about innovation in 4 minutes. And the ABC people and the Disney people were feeling very threatened by video over the internet and what that was going to do to news and entertainment and so forth. And we decided to go back to the battles between TV and radio and between black and white and color TV, rather than trying to be smart directly about what was happening in the here and now, and try to draw some analogies to try to help them understand what kinds of, how change occurs, how new things threaten old things, and what kinds of ideas might be enduring and valuable. So Phil, could you please run the tape for me? You'll see a lot of copyright material from ABC in here.
It's been argued radically that TV is destined to make obsolete the radio, movies, and magazines, just as electricity knocked out the gaslit lamp. Something it would seem would have to give. Meet MIT Professor Jim Utterback.
Technology builds up through an experimental period when people are trying all sorts of different new things. And then at some point, a design that's acceptable or even wonderful for most users appears.
The industry is split. This time it's on the issue of black and white versus color. And in television, such splits take on the confusion of a stream of consciousness session on a psychiatrist's couch.
Why do things develop in unexpected ways? A new thing tends to be as a substitute for something that's familiar. But once it's available in the marketplace, users tend to address it playfully and take it in directions that are important to them, that the person who developed the idea at first never could have imagined.
The answer is that, like most television problems, it is anything but simple. Television has been born to trouble, and the roots go deep.
The most wonderful products typically are combinations of things that at first wouldn't strike you as going together. There's sort of a creative synthesis pulling together different ideas. We find that often the most disruptive new ideas are made out of elements that are already there and well tested, but brought together in a very new way. When does technology clash with people's needs? I think technology and people's needs clash when we overcomplicate a product. We add complexity, features and functions that go beyond what most people would like to have in it. I don't think technology makes a firm vulnerable. In fact, if you look at things that have overturned great firms, the technology was not a mystery. They could see the technology, or at least anticipate it. They could understand it. In most cases, were even experimenting with it in their own laboratories. We began telling stories from the written word and later the printed word, and now perhaps with television or the internet. But it's still sharing experiences and sharing culture and values, so the basic value of storytelling and sharing hasn't changed. What kinds of innovations endure for many years? I think it's the ones that are simple and elegant, that combine several functions to meet a basic human need, like the light bulb, or the flush toilet, or the paper bag.
Well, I asked my kids what they thought of this, and they said, "Cool music, Dad." We used this to introduce an exercise where we put one of the 100 great inventions of the century in a brown paper bag on a table, and then the people around the table had to take it out and discuss it and its meaning and so on. And Richard asked me to critique the list of 100, and I said, "Richard, it's a great list. You saw some of the things there, the toilet and the Bayer aspirin and all, the light bulb." I said, "But it's missing a couple of things." I said, I don't see the mousetrap. You know, it's the 100th anniversary of the mousetrap this year." And then I said, "And you know, birth control pills and pharmaceuticals, they had a big impact." And there was dead silence on the other end of the line. And then this comment comes, "You're trying to make me lose my job, Jim." And I said, "No, Richard, what do you mean?" He said, "You're out to get me. What are you doing to me?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Jim, think about it. Disney, Mickey Mouse, mousetrap, family values, birth control pills. What are you trying to do to me?" So kind of put me in a different frame of reference. Okay. So, I mean, there are a couple of important lessons hidden in here. Functions are much more stable than technologies, and we communicate or compute or create images in different ways, but we're still trying to do that creative function. And I think when we get caught up in technology, we often find ourselves defeated by lack of understanding of the market or changes in the market. And but the other thing that's happening is each time we see technology in a new guise, it isn't necessarily the case that television replaces radio, or that the movies or TV replaces the movies, or the DVD replaces the television. But sometimes they're actually symbiotic. One helps the other grow and vice versa. Or in competing with one another, they drive to create new segments of the market that actually cause growth. And one of my students actually brought data in on DVDs and movies the other day. And it turns out since the DVD was created, attendance at movies has doubled, but the use of recorded media at home has quadrupled. So movies have gone from about 4 billion to 8, and recorded media have gone from maybe 6 billion to almost 24 billion. So it's really quite an example of how the new and the old actually reinforce and build on one another. And I think that's the important message. It isn't that the new idea kills the old idea, but it rather, in the best guise, creates a tremendously expanding market and a premium, and gets the premium growth, while the old technology maybe continues for an unexpectedly long time, but is fairly stable. So we still have a huge coal industry, for example, even though oil and gas have grown tremendously. And the mainframe computer industry is still surprisingly robust in markets like servers and data storages, even though we focus on the burgeoning of the personal computer. In fact, they're, I think, about equal markets now. So it is not the case that the personal computer has displaced the mainframe, but it has certainly taken the premium growth in the market. Okay, now I wanted to show you something from the work I did to create my book, Mastering the Dynamics of Innovation, that really astonished me. I was not prepared for this finding, and I've hidden what it is for a minute just to tease you. This is the number of firms in a number of industries just in the United States over time. And if we had a little more time, I'd like to just tease you by asking you what industries you thought these might be. I actually used this in April of last year in England, and people were guessing, well, the tall peak over here, that's probably .com, and maybe the blue dots are biotech, and maybe the red dots are personal computers or semiconductors and so forth. But the truth is that the graph starts in 1874 and goes to about 1960, and the red dots are the automobile industry in the United States. There were 104 companies in the automobile industry that produced cars for 4 years or more, for 5 years or more. So this does not include the famous Tucker Company. It doesn't include the infamous DeLorean Company. It doesn't include Bricklin. It doesn't include lots and lots of companies that you might have heard of, because they didn't produce cars for 5 years or more. And in fact, if you look at different sources for populations of companies in the auto industry. The numbers range as high as 1,600 to 2,500 companies. Now, some of those companies were just fraudulent paper companies. Some of them became design firms. Some became like Fisher Body Works. Some became parts manufacturers. Some became dealerships. So they're requiring that a company produced cars for 5 years or more is a pretty stringent filter to get 104 companies. Actually, the Cord company produced cars for 2 years and went broke, was reconstructed, and a few years later produced cars for 3 years and then went broke permanently. And so it's only 103 if you say 5 continuous years. And in fact, the peak there is in 1923 when the all-steel drawn and welded body structure was introduced with the Chevrolet and Plymouth models. So 2/3 of the companies failed by the time the Depression started. And the failure was due to the fact that the new idea for design and manufacturing massively increased the scale and reduced the variety of what an automobile was to be. It created what I've called a dominant design, or rather what Bill Abernathy and I, working together, called that in Bill's wonderful work, The Productivity Dilemma. Something that really surprised me, I thought before I did this work that there were lots of ways to get to heaven. I thought you could get to heaven in the early entrepreneurial stages of an industry by being very good at experimenting with products, and later on you could start and get to heaven by being very good at manufacturing innovation, and still later on being very good at logistics and cost and so forth. And in fact, none of the companies that survived started after 1923. Now, it's not true that starting early helps you as much as people think, but certainly starting before this crystallization of the industry is very, very important. The other industries, respectively, are typewriters, the first one, which crystallized in 1906 with the Underwood Model 5 typewriter, and then televisions is the really high peak. TV picture tubes is the next thing, the blue dots. And that's an interesting part-whole relationship, or system-subsystem relationship. So the subsystem, the all-glass picture tube, was developed after the RCA standard became the National Television Standard Committee standard. And then we have the transistor. The real sharp little peak is the electronic calculator, and then the integrated circuit, and then massively the little bitty peak there is massively parallel scientific supercomputers. Now, there's no particular relationship among these mountains. It's simply sampling bias over time. But there is a hidden, you might say, well, there are smaller peaks or faster change. None of that is true if you look more broadly at 50 or 60 industries. But there is a hidden relationship here, and that is that larger markets attract more firms. So cars and TVs are huge markets, and you get many, many more firms rushing in. And the anomaly here is typewriters. There were far more typewriter firms than there should have been, given the ultimate size of the market. Okay, so why should we care about that? Well, why we should care is that each time there's a break with the past, there's a new mountain of firms, and new leadership emerges. So when the typewriter changes from manual to electric, we get a whole different coterie of firms. And Underwood is displaced. Underwood and Remington are displaced as the leaders, and IBM and Burroughs come forward. And then when the word processor comes along, IBM is displaced by Wang. And when the personal computer with word processing software comes along, Wang is replaced by Compaq and Dell and so forth. And ironically, the firms that are displaced have all the ideas and technology that exists in the new product. Wang is the saddest case of all. In 1975, they had essentially a personal computer with a disk drive and a disk operating system and beautiful word processing software, and they could have become Apple or Kpro, one of the startups in personal computers, they could have become Microsoft, and they did neither. They were completely riveted on the idea of producing word processors and document systems. So the second largest employer in Massachusetts, or third largest employer, went broke. And it is our commitment to a narrow frame of reference, it seems to me, that is the seeds of destruction of large firms that are successful in one generation, and creates the difficulty they seem to have in transitioning to the next generation. Now, I've been quoted by a number of people as saying old firms can never change to the new, and in fact the statistics are 1 chance in 4. So it's not quite as grim as never. Okay, so here are the industries. And Clay Christensen has written a nice book since mine was published, called The Innovator's Dilemma: Why New Technologies Cause Great Firms to Fail. And he and I recently collaborated on an article along with a Sloan doctoral student, Fernando Suarez, who's teaching at the London Business School. It's called Strategies for Success in Fast-Moving Industries, in Fast-Changing Industries, which was published in Management Science. It's Christensen, Suarez, and Utterback. And this is a chart from that which recasts Clay's disk drive data to simply show you that it matches the pattern that I've seen in the other industries. In fact, I plotted this while I was traveling in Europe. I had a manuscript by Clay, who was then an assistant professor. And I became so excited about this. I said, my God, this young man has all the data I need to test my theory completely. Because all the other work was kind of retrospective. And here was a chance to do something prospectively and statistically, because he has every variable you can imagine about the industry from disk trend reports. And the time change really frustrated me, because I wanted to call him up and ask him a question. And I had to wait until the middle of the afternoon. I finally got a phone call through to Clay at the Harvard Business School. And I said, Clay, I've been reading your manuscript you gave me. Can you tell me if there was a time when the disk drive industry crystallized, when change stopped, and the technology became standardized? And he started telling me this long technical story, which is in the paper, about voice coil actuators with feedback and stepper motors and motors in spindles and smart electronic interfaces. And I said, Clay, when did it happen? And of course, you know the answer I wanted, right? The theory is that the technology crystallizes at the peak of the mountain. And the wave, that's when the wave of entering firms ends and the wave of exiting firms really begins to build. That's the idea. And I really wanted him to say 1983, but I was kind of being a little bit conservative. I said, well, you know, 1982 and 84 only one firm different, and you know, 1980 and 85 are kind of only a couple firms. You know, anywhere in that 5-year range would be okay. I was kind of hedging my bets. And Clay said, Jim, it was 1983. I almost jumped off my chair. I thought, theory confirmed. But we've done a much better job in the article in Management Science. So I just wanted to show you that it's not all old data. And again, this is kind of like TV picture tubes. It's a subsystem of a larger system, the personal computer. Okay, now I wanted to end with one last story to make a little different point. And this is the story of the oldest industry in my book, actually. I shouldn't have put the title up there, because in fact, I've been consulting for British Petroleum and several other oil companies in technology over recent years. And I can only identify one difference between this industry and the oil industry. This industry essentially sold energy. And my dad harvested ice for the family icebox in Iowa. This was the way you kept food cold 100 years ago, or even in 1940 was the way half of all the people in the United States kept food cold, and 2/3 of the people in Boston. And now, of course, we get oil or gas and make electricity and run a refrigerator. And after we did harvested ice, we used coal and steam and made ice and delivered blocks of machine-made ice. So we have 3 generations here: natural ice, machine-made ice, electric refrigeration, now maybe super sterilization. But it really is a way of packaging energy and shipping energy. There's a wonderful new book out called The Frozen Water Trade, which is all about the entrepreneurship and finance in this industry. And the amazing thing about it is that entrepreneurs here in Boston figured out how to load boats up with ice, just like we load boats up with oil or LNG today, and ship it all the way to India. And they dominated the huge export market that they created for natural ice around the world. So they started as a craft industry. It went from entrepreneurial to highly organized, from general to specialized tools and methods. There were over 80 equipment supply companies right here in Boston serving the ice industry. And that's a mixed blessing, because once you create an equipment supply industry like semiconductor equipment, then they teach everybody in the world how to make the product. And so once the equipment supply industry really got going, we lost our export market, because everyone else in the world, from Alaska to Norway, learned how to efficiently make ice to ship and to use. It went from labor-intensive to capital-intensive, from a luxury good to a commodity. In fact, in Thomas Jefferson and George Washington's time, ice cost $100 a ton in $1,800. And by 1865, it cost 10 cents a ton in $1865. So it's a 1,000 to 1 difference in cost of a ton of ice. Went from varied to standard 100-pound blocks. I mentioned the prices. Went from tons produced to millions of tons, from hundreds of firms in that mountain to 8 large integrated firms. In fact, there were Senate hearings about the ice monopoly. And if you read the Senate hearings about the ice monopoly and the Senate hearings about the OPEC oil cartel and predatory pricing and so on, it's just a perfect parallel. And went from local markets, as I mentioned, to global markets. Now, I'd like to show you an 11-minute videotape done by Professor Underwood in our Department of Food Science and Nutrition in 1926. This is another picture of George Eastman in 1925 on the Carpathia, going to Africa to photograph wild animals. And the importance of this is that the portable movie camera was a brand new invention in 1925, and Professor Underwood of MIT was one of the early adopters in 1926, and you'll see him with both the camera and the movie that he made of ice harvesting to really explain to people what this great industry was all about. So please run the tape. This is from the MIT Museum. I was absolutely astonished after I wrote my book to find this image of the industry so that I could use in lectures and to really tell you what this is all about. I edited from about an hour and a half to, I should have edited 2 or 3 more minutes of it out. But you'll see many of our modern ideas were embodied in this tape in 1926. We keep rediscovering things if they're valuable. Sorry, 1927. Now, Spy Pond is just across, it's just beyond Fresh Pond. And this was happening on Fresh Pond as well. Now, I have to tell you, this is the way a professor should live. Professor Underwood's dad founded the food canning, there's the portable camera. He founded the, I love this. I come back from board meetings and I sit at the table waiting for my wife to put the napkin in my lap, and she says, you know, if you want to be treated like that, you better go and be a CEO. So, anyway, Professor Underwood's father founded the food canning industry in America down in South Boston. And so he was the scion of a wealthy entrepreneur, became a professor here. much like Henry Kendall, the third generation of the Kendall whaling family and founder of manufacturing in Kendall Square, became a professor. So you could see Spy Pond. Here comes the ice plow out of the mists of time. This was one of the specialized pieces of equipment. And in earlier times, there were a number of different blades, but here you can see there are only 2 blades. And you'll see in a minute why that is. It was a further step in productivity. Isn't this amazing? Here, if you look over in the lobby of the E-52, there's a picture of a Fordson tractor made by Henry Ford. It had a Model T motor. And they were using that, but really more horsepower to scrape the snow off the ice. Now here they're laying out the work and getting it all ready for harvesting. This is making me a bit dizzy. I'm going to get a little further from the screen. Here was an attempt to save the industry from machine-made ice. This is what not to do. This is using new technology to defend the old industry. So a circular, self-propelled, gas-powered ice saw. And this is even a worse idea. This is, whenever we go on LFM factory tours, you can see people automating the manual process. This is a very bad idea. But they figured out, and you can see Professor Underwood just looking on in bewilderment. So this is, you know, automating the hand ice saw. Here's the way it was traditionally done. It's kind of like cutting glass. By the way, this was day labor for 10 cents an hour. And you lined up, and if they needed you, you got a job until you took a break, and then they'd hire someone else. I asked one of my neighbors who died in his 80s, I said, do you know anything about the ice industry? And he said, know anything about it. I used to work in it. And he told me about, it was like working on the docks, and he said one time he worked for 86 hours without taking a break because he was hungry, and he got $8.60. So it was a tough industry to work in. You can see food processing and food warehouses in the background, and they would ship ice and dairy products and fish all the way to the Midwest in refrigerated freight cars at this point. Here they're getting the work all ready. They've cut a channel. There's the foreman managing by walking around, checking everything. And you can see they've made these huge cakes, and they're going to take them back to the ice house, which you see in the background. Now, at this point, the biggest building in New England was an ice house. It was as big as Boston Garden. It was in Portland, Maine. Now here they're using a diesel-powered circular saws underwater to cut up the big cakes into small cakes. That was a new idea in 1927, as opposed to using horsepower to make it all into 100-pound blocks. Here's materials handling in 1927. Now, if you've ever gone to see an automotive plant, I challenge you to tell me what's different here. You know, it's very much become an assembly line, and of course, that's what happens to the horse manure. And if you've read Professor von Hippel's book, Sources of Invention, there's a user-based innovation. Well, here we'll see that I should have taken this out. This is just some more materials handling. I'm sure you're not fascinated with it at all. But here is the ice going up to be loaded into the ice house. And they just layered it, layer after layer. Some of these ice houses were 100 feet high, 300 feet deep. Along the Hudson River at this point, there were 7 continuous miles of ice storage houses for New York City. And here's the delivery end of the thing. 100-pound blocks. There's one real modern guy at the beginning who has a truck. But both my dad and my wife's father grew up on farms and ran teams of horses, and I'm kind of sorry I never had a chance to do this kind of work. This really looks to me like a real job. And I really serious. It looks, you know, some days I just get sick of sitting at a desk in front of a screen, and I think, well, this would have been fun. But here, isn't this wonderful? Look at this wonderful team of horses and the huge ice house in the background. He's weighing his load. At this point, the wagons were standardized, barges were standardized, the chains, all the materials handling the saws were standardized, and even the thickness of the blocks was standardized by flooding water out on the surface overnight to make the ice a standard thickness every day so that you could have everything be uniform. So now, we could stop at this point, but he's going to go back to the Underwood's house and deliver a block of ice. Here you can see it's exactly 100 pounds, right? This, you wouldn't have to go to the gym if you had this job. And Mrs. Underwood has a very modern refrigerator because instead of having the ice drip across the kitchen as it did in our house when I was a kid, here you can put the ice in from the outside, and she has a door on the inside. Now I have 3 friends with homes like this, and this is the world's best wine cellar. If you have an ice box like that, you really don't need a wine cellar. Now here's the voice of the customer. Oh. By the way, this is one of the reasons why internet grocery stores broke down. There was nobody at home to accept the delivery. Right? This is a way of doing business it would really be hard to replicate today. Well, there's about 30 more seconds of this, which I left on just to show you that Professor's jokes haven't gotten any better over time. Okay, well, I guess I'll just tell you the conclusion because it's time to stop. As we see the Iceman go into the distant past here. And that is that each one of these innovations, harvested ice created a huge worldwide market. And then amazingly, when machine-made ice came along, and I'll make this the last piece of the presentation, there was an exponential demand of factories to make ice, especially in places that didn't have easy access to ice and water transportation. But the advent of machine-made ice actually tripled the demand for harvested ice. So the market, just like DVDs and theater, just burgeoned because now you had cheap, widely available refrigeration everywhere all the time without any uncertainty or doubt about being able to get ice to keep your refrigerated shipment cold or your warehouse cold or whatever. And lots of industries like beer brewing were advantaged because at the time beer brewing had half its assets tied up in ice inventory. Now you could get just-in-time ice. And then the industry actually grew until about the 1950s. When I think the last ice plant was actually built in 1956, and it's still going as a very profitable enterprise. They've specialized in ice for ice sculptures. So they make this beautiful crystalline ice for, for your banquet or wedding celebration. And then, of course, refrigeration has come along and grown exponentially. So it's not, the market has grown and burgeoned and expanded with each innovation and with each productivity advance. And I think maybe as a final comment, what I've been observing over time, looking at the dynamics of innovation over time, is that new and old technologies often start out in a symbiotic relationship, each helping the other to grow. Then they move into a predator and prey relationship, where one strengthens the other, and then finally into a purely competitive relationship. So I think it's important then to look at new ideas as massive opportunities and to not think of them as substitutes, but think of them, even a 100-pound block of ice made by machine is different than a 100-pound block of ice harvested and stored, and has a different application and a different set of economics and different market dynamics, and was brought in by different firms in different geographies. And again, massive. If you could think of any pure substitute, it would be 200-pound blocks of ice created in different ways. But in fact, they reinforced one another and massively expanded the market and had different uses. And that the true meaning of any new idea really comes through lots and lots of creativity and experimentation with your customers. So I hope I've gotten you to abandon the idea that new technologies always wipe out old technologies. Sometimes you can be great partners. Sometimes you can discover whole new syntheses and applications, as Edison and Eastman did. And I guess we don't have time to really have a debate about this. But my own feeling is that Sloan, in the middle of this massive entrepreneurial ferment that we have going on around here, and the amazing technological opportunities that are going on all around MIT, and I hope you'll have a chance to see a little of that, see the new buildings that are going up, see some of the new initiatives while you're here, has a very, very special role to play as a cornerstone of the 21st century, as a place for thinking about ideas and possibilities for new industries and new social benefits, new sources of creating wealth. I've shown you how wealth was created 50 years ago, and it's kind of fun that it's quaint, because it shows that we really, 50 years from now, will be doing things we can hardly imagine today. I know you can hardly imagine this was a massive, multi-billion-dollar, profitable global industry, but it was. And I think the same thing that happened to the ice industry will happen to today's dominant industries. And 50 years from now, we'll have a whole ensemble of industry that I hope we're creating right here today that will seem as new. When my dad had his 60th birthday, Neil Armstrong stepped out on the moon. And he had grown up, farming with a team of horses. And I hope when we have a reunion in 15 or 20 years, the world will seem as fresh to us compared to the world today as the landing on the moon seemed amazing to my dad compared to his experiences in the 1940s. So thank you for your attention. If I could make a shameless plug, there are a few copies of my book out on the table. And thank all of you classmates and other reunion generations for being here at Sloan. We really appreciate your coming. Thanks again.